Welcome, high school biology students, to another edition of Our Explainer. Today we're tackling something huge. I mean, literally the massive, infinitely complex machinery of our entire planet's biosphere. But we're going to do it by looking at something much smaller. We're going to anchor our entire lesson today on a simple local pond. By visualizing and really understanding the mechanics of a pond, we actually unlock the exact same rules that govern the entire Earth. So let's get into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap for today. First up, we'll welcome you to the pond and define our terms. Second, we'll look at the producers making organic life possible. Third, we map out energy flow and food webs. Fourth, we calculate the harsh realities of the 10% rule. And finally, number 5, we're looking at how life is recycled through nutrient cycles.
All right, Section 1, welcome to the pond, the ultimate microcosm. Let's start by framing exactly what we're looking at when we gaze into the shallow water of a local pond. Make sure you get this down in your notes, guys. An ecosystem is a functional unit of nature where living organisms interact among themselves and also with their surrounding physical environment. Now, an ecosystem can be as vast as the ocean or a huge forest, but a pond? It's a brilliant, self-sustainable example because it's perfectly contained. If you can understand the functional unit of a pond, you understand the functional unit of the whole globe. It's like a giant puzzle, but we're just looking at one perfectly complete corner. So every ecosystem, including our pond, is basically split into two integrated halves. First, we have the abiotic or non-living components. This is the water with all its dissolved substances, the rich soil deposited at the bottom, the solar input, the cycle of temperature, and the day length. Then, on the other side, we have the biotic or living components. This includes autotrophs like phytoplankton, consumers like zooplankton and fish, and decomposers like fungi and bacteria. The continuous interaction between these two sides is what creates the entire physical structure of our ecosystem.
Moving right along to Section 2, making organics, the producers.
Now, what's really interesting here is the biological magic trick that literally kicks off the entire system. For an ecosystem to function, it needs a constant input of solar energy. And our autotrophs, the phytoplankton and algae floating around in the pond, they perform an absolute miracle. They take entirely inorganic materials, right? Radiant energy from the sun, simple water, and carbon dioxide, and they actually convert it into organic material. They're creating the complex biological building blocks of life, like sugars and biomass, right out of thin air. Well, water and sunlight, but you get the idea.
And this brings us to a really crucial measurement for our pond's economy, gross primary productivity, or GPP. Think of GPP as the gross income of our ecosystem. It's the total rate at which organic matter is produced during photosynthesis by the plants. Basically, it's the total solar energy that was successfully captured and turned into biological currency.
But, just like a business has overhead costs, plants have to spend some of that energy just to survive. A considerable amount of GPP is utilized by the plants themselves in respiration. So if we take the gross primary productivity and subtract those respiration losses, which we represent with an R, we get net primary productivity, or NPP. This NPP is the absolutely crucial number. It represents the available biomass. In other words, it's the actual food left over for all the heterotrophs, meaning the herbivores and decomposers, to actually consume.
Okay, Section 3, energy flow and food webs, or as I like to call it, who eats whom.
Now that we've captured our solar energy and turned it into organic food, it's time to see who eats whom in our pond. But before we track that flow, I want you to consider this tiny number for a second, 2 to 10%. Of all the incident solar radiation hitting the Earth, less than half is photosynthetically active radiation, or PAR. And of that PAR, plants capture a shockingly tiny 2 to 10%. That microscopic fraction of solar energy is what sustains the entire living world. I mean, it's just staggering when you really think about it.
Let's see how this builds into a grazing food chain. The flow of energy here is strictly unidirectional. It's a one-way street. It starts with our phytoplankton, the producers. They get eaten by the zooplankton, which are our primary consumers, or herbivores. Then a small fish comes along and eats the zooplankton. That makes the small fish a secondary consumer, or primary carnivore. And finally, a big fish eats the small fish, acting as our tertiary consumer. So the energy captured from the sun just keeps moving one direction straight up this chain.
Which brings us to Section 4, the 10% rule, the cost of living.
Now, you might be wondering, why does the food chain just stop at the big fish? Why don't we have endlessly larger fish eating each other in a 20-step chain? Well, that brings us to the cost of living. Ecosystems are not exempt from the second law of thermodynamics.
There is a universal tendency toward increasing disorder, and keeping a body functioning requires energy. Because of this, the transfer of energy through the food chain follows the 10% law. Only 10% of the energy from one trophic level is successfully transferred to the next higher level. The vast majority, the other 90%, is just dissipated and lost to the environment as heat.
And because of this massive drop in energy at each step, ecosystem populations naturally form upright ecological pyramids. Whether you're looking at a pyramid of number, a pyramid of biomass, or a pyramid of energy, the base is almost always incredibly wide. You literally need millions of phytoplankton at the bottom just to support a few large carnivore fish at the very top.
All right, our final stop, Section 5, Recycling Life, Nutrient Cycles, the Detritus Path.
So we know energy is a one-way street that ends in lost heat. But what happens to the physical matter of the organisms when they actually die? Well, this is the detritus path. When an organism dies, say a plant drops a leaf or a fish passes away, it becomes detritus. It falls all the way to the bottom of our pond. And right here, the detritus food chain begins. It's completely driven by decomposers, mostly heterotrophic fungi and bacteria known as saprotrophs. They secrete digestive enzymes to break down this dead waste, beautifully returning all those locked up nutrients back to the soil and the water.
I know. It sounds like a totally messy business, but scientifically, decomposition occurs in 5 highly elegant steps. First step is fragmentation, where detritivores like earthworms or pond-bottom dwellers break the organic matter down into smaller pieces. Second is leaching, where water-soluble inorganic nutrients seep down deep into the soil. Third is catabolism, where bacterial and fungal enzymes break the matter down even further. Fourth is humification, which forms a dark, nutrient-rich reservoir called humus. And fifth is mineralization, where microbes finally release those base inorganic nutrients right back into the ecosystem to be reused by plants.
So the crucial point is this absolute fundamental rule of biology, perfectly illustrated right here in our pond. Energy flows. It is strictly unidirectional, from the sun to the producers, up the food chain, and ultimately lost forever to the environment as heat. But nutrients cycle. The carbon, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, they're never lost. They move through the biosphere in biogeochemical cycles, passing from living things to dead things, through the decomposers, and right back into the earth to be used indefinitely, over and over again.
We've spent our time today inside the boundary of our pond to understand these massive global rules. But now, it's time to break that boundary and apply this systems thinking to yourselves. You know, a single species can occupy more than one trophic level simultaneously, depending on what it eats. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to ponder before your next meal. Based on everything we've learned today about producers, consumers, and energy pyramids, how many different trophic levels do human beings actually function at in a food chain? Think about that. Thanks for learning with me today on Our Explainer. See you next time.